Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeremy Collins, the Senior Director of Programs here at the National World War II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. It's great to have you all here tonight with us. I want to thank you for being here. Before we begin, those of you who are regulars, which is pretty much all of you, you know the drill. We'd like to make some important recognitions of those in the audience. Whether they're here or not, if they can stand or wave, we'd like to recognize any World War II veterans, home front workers, or Holocaust survivors. Would any veterans or active duty members of our armed forces, regardless of era, please stand or wave and be recognized for your service to our country? And lastly, would any family members of those who have served or are currently serving please stand or wave and be recognized for what you do in support of those who support us. Thank you all for your service. I'd also like to make a special shout out and thanks to those members of our Patriot Circle and charter members who are here with us tonight. You all and your support allow us to bring authors and programs like this to you, and also cheese and wine. And you also fill our seats so that we can make sure those here in person and those at home watching get a wonderful and educational show. I do want a special announcement tonight, and that is a shout out to World War II U.S. Navy veteran of the Pacific Theater, Arthur Grubiner from Queens, New York, whose son let us know that he was certainly going to be tuning in, and if he wasn't about to turn 99, he may be down here to watch in person, because this is a very important topic. But also, he would have to decide if he was going to miss Game 3 of the Mets tonight. I don't know if you would rate over the Mets for him. But Arthur, thank you for your service. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope to host you down here. He served on an APA in the Pacific and was part of the amphibious operations off of Luzon and Okinawa, including kamikaze attacks in 1945. We have some VIPs here. We have one of our founding presidential counselors, Dr. Gunter Bischoff, recently retired of University of New Orleans, who was with Stephen Ambrose and Nick Mueller at the creation here of the National D-Day Museum. He's here with Melanie Boulay, his wife. Thank you both for being here and for all you've done for over 25 years. And from one wonderful academic partner to another, we have three of our faculty members and representatives from Arizona State University who are in town for some important meetings that just concluded today. Jason, Kathy, Jan, if you don't mind waving. It's with Arizona State, that's who we have our World War II Studies Master's Degree online program with, and a lot of great stuff came out of yesterday and today as well, so thank you guys for being here tonight. Now on to tonight. We have Rona Simmons here to discuss her latest book, No Average Day, The 24 Hours of October 24th, 1944. Rona is the award-winning author of both fiction and nonfiction. This is her fourth book on World War II, and we should mention that it officially comes out October 24th, very appropriately. But for those of you here, you notice we have it back there because the University of Missouri Press was kind enough to give us some early copies, so you can get it a week before anyone else has their hands on it. Some of her other titles include Images from World War II, The Other Veterans of World War II, Stories from Behind the Front Lines, and A Gathering of Men. The latter two were awarded gold medals from the Military Writers Society of America. Rona's interest in World War II is through her family connections, her father who was a P-38 pilot, and her father-in-law who served on a bomber of the 8th Air Force in the 100th Bomb Group, which was the key unit that was featured in Masters of the Air. She is a graduate of Tulane, so welcome home, and Georgia State University, and after a 30-year career in business, she launched her career in writing. She has written for literary journals, online and print magazines and newspaper, and is active in her local writing communities. Interviewing Rona tonight will be one of our own, Dr. Bradley Hart. Bradley is our World War II military historian here at the Museums Institute. Just joined us in July, I believe. Yep. He earned his PhD in history from Churchill College, University of Cambridge, and is the author of 2 books, including Hitler's American Friends, The Third Reich's Supporters in the United States. Additionally, Bradley has published numerous articles on interwar politics, diplomacy, and intelligence history. His current research is focused on information warfare in the Second World War. Prior to joining us, he taught at California State University, Fresno, and has worked as an International Affairs Fellow on Capitol Hill. Since joining us, we've put him to work, working with ASU, working on our digital content. You'll see a number of articles, some videos that Bradley's participated in, and podcasts. He is a wonderful member of our team, and he will do a wonderful job tonight or else. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Bradley Hart and Rona Simmons.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, for that kind introduction, and no pressure, I have to say, after that. Rona Simmons, thank you so much for joining us here at the National World War II Museum. It's a real pleasure to be with you tonight, and thank you for sharing this book with us and our audience before it's officially come out, which is very exciting for all of us here. I had the pleasure of reading your book in preparation for this, and I've been sort of talking about the themes in it with some of my colleagues here at the Institute and some of our visitors and the other groups that come to visit with us. And I tell people, you know, it's about the deadliest day for Americans in World War II, and they say, oh, you mean Pearl Harbor?
Exactly.
And then I say, no, it's not Pearl Harbor. And they say, oh, well, you mean D-Day. And I say, no, it's not D-Day either. And they sort of look at me confusedly then and say, well, what are you talking about? And I say, it's October 24th, 1944. And at that point, you get a totally blank stare out of almost everyone I tell about this. So it's a fascinating concept for a book. How did you come up with the idea, before we get into the events of that terrible day, how did you come up with the idea, and what were some of the challenges you encountered researching and writing a book like this?
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for the museum having me. It's truly an honor, and especially even a week before the book comes out, so it's a great preview. It is about 3 years in the making, and as all of you know, there are countless, I won't even say books, countless bookshelves full of World War II books. And so if you want to write about World War II, you choose to write about World War II, you have to come up with something that people don't know about. You know, you can't write about my father, the P-38 pilot, or D-Day, or Midway, or any of the big battles. People who have spent their lives, historians, have already written that, so you have to look for something very different. And it's not one answer. From a very pragmatic standpoint, I tried to find something, and we have just a couple slides here. I tried to find something that people don't know. Like you say, people know about Pearl Harbor. People know about D-Day, or think they do. And so those events were blasted on the newspapers, you know, the 2-inch high headlines. So I started thinking, well, what do people not know? Is there maybe another day that we haven't heard for some reason? So that thought was at the back of my head. But then I decided that it's really more basic than that. With that premise, it was, I do this because I am passionate about World War II, having come from a military-based family, but I also, as the generations pass, and you meet young people who barely know that there was a World War II, or barely know who fought in World War II, and the thought of what my father and my father-in-law did for us and all of the 16 million men and women who fought, that I just can't let that go without some recognition and doing what I can to preserve their memory. So that started me down the path. All right, I know I'm going to write about people, but how do you tell the next generation, or the one after that, what war really is? And especially from someone like me, I didn't go to war, I didn't fight in war, and thank goodness haven't yet, or had to. How do you tell someone what war is like if you're not going to write about the battles, the great naval battles or Army ground battles? And to me, it's always been, and through my earlier books, talking about individuals. Taking the war from, say, the 26,000, 30,000 foot person up in a bomber or fighter and bringing it down to the ground, not necessarily meaning to the Army, but to an individual, whether it's someone in the back of a plane or someone on the ground, and then helping a young person put their feet into those shoes and walk their walk. And so that's, I knew I would do a story about individuals again. I knew I would find something that no one had found. And so I looked past those big headlines, and I knew I wanted it to be global, because so many people I talk to, if I write a book about Europe in the war, they say, well, why didn't you address the Pacific? And if you write about the Pacific, someone said, well, why didn't you write about what happened in Europe? And I wanted it to be global. I wanted people to know that there was a global war going on, that people were fighting and dying across the globe. It wasn't just D-Day, it wasn't just Pearl Harbor. So that's when I said, I've got to find a day, so it's going to be later in the war, when there were people fighting across the globe. And I started just picking off different days, different battles. I didn't, again, want it to be about a single battle. And I do a lot of research about individuals and profile them. And this date just kept coming up, October 24th. And I thought, well, what's that? And I would, being the obsessive compulsive person that I am, I had my little check boxes of who, what day, what month. And that block just kept filling up as faster than most others, because if it was D-Day, I was ignoring it. If it was Pearl Harbor, I was ignoring it. And I kept coming back to it. I thought, well, what happened on that day? And that's when I stumbled on, if you will, and I guess half of this is luck. So that's when I found out that day, and then we went from there.
Luck is always good for historians when it comes to finding those stories that no one else has told before. More than 2,600 men and women lost their lives on October 24th, 1944, which is a really astonishing amount, even in a conflict as bloody as World War II was. How did you, from this mass of people who lost their lives this day, how did you choose which stories to focus on and profile in the book?
Well, in the side, you can see there, as I was going around the globe documenting these individuals, and we'll get back to some of the individual people up there, but they were stories that stood out, and as I would research one, I would find more than just a tick box, because to me, honoring these people is more than just getting their birth date and the day they died and where they died. It was really drilling down into their stories. And I've picked a few, and I always hate to do this because I feel like I'm doing a disservice to all of the rest of them. But just to give you an idea of the breadth of what we have found, on the far left is Gervis Haltom. And he was actually the first story I found. And I say, again, luck, it was the internet. I was researching and just saw this story about Peter Renfrance, who was looking for his uncle who was killed in a plane crash in the Pacific. And he had gone to a number of the islands because there was very sketchy information about his uncle. So he was going to the different islands. And he was on Yap Island. And I don't know if you can see it on the map, but on the left there's the Pacific Ocean. And I did not know where Yap Island was. I did not know there was a Yap Island. But Yap Island is between Peleliu, where Gervis Haltom was stationed, and Guam. So really in the middle of nowhere. And Peter Renfrance went to that island and has searched for his uncle. And the citizens there said, no, we don't have any records of your uncle, but there is this grave we want to show you. And they had found the grave at the end of the runway where his plane crashed. And they had been attending it. Now, he was actually found in 1947, 2 years after the end of the war, when we repatriated many of the men in the Pacific. But in those 2 years after he crashed and died on October 24th, the local people dug his grave, buried him, and tended to it, and keeping the jungle from encroaching on that. And they told him the story and showed them where it was, and he ended up erecting a monument to Gervis Haltom. So that was the first story, and I said, okay, this is this book, so we'll go on from there. And then the second type of story, when you say, how do I pick them, they sort of picked themselves and came to me. The next one is Herman Joseph Adolphe. And in my research, I always try to find, if I can find a relative of one of these people, because the story comes so much more alive when you can talk to someone about the person. I found his son and daughter-in-law, and they sent me reams of paper about Herman Adolphe, who was also a pilot. He was killed. He was flying, actually, he joined the Navy originally, long before the war. He did 2 tours of duty before the war broke out. And then he got bit, as they say, by the flying bug. And he wanted to fly above all else. But America was not in a war. And of course, a lot of the young men thought, well, if I don't get in a war now and get to fly, it's going to be over. Little did they know. And so he went to Canada, because Canada was recruiting. They were in the war, and they knew they did not have enough citizens to fill the need for their bombers or fighters. So he crossed over, and Canada, it was against the law to actually solicit men from the United States to go to war for a different country. But they got the word out, and word went from person to person, and Herman heard about this, so he went to Canada, got his wings, flew for Canada, actually was transferred to Europe, to England, and was over there fighting for Canada when D-Day happened. And he said, that's it. So he joined the American Air Forces. And he was traveling, carrying cargo into Belgium on a mission, and they got just a few degrees off course, and a few degrees became more than a few degrees, and they came in over Dunkirk, which was still under occupation, and actually a fight between the Czechoslovakians, Germans, and the British there, and his plane was shot down. And they could not find him, and his plane crashed into the opening area where the German submarine pens were. So his plane was blocking the submarine pens, and they had to bomb it to get it out of the area. And of course, all the men were killed instantly anyway, but what happened, that was that for years and years, but then the Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency, which is the organization that is still working today to bring home our men across the world, they went overseas. They found witnesses who told them where the men that did survive the crash were. They exhumed the bodies, they buried them, and unfortunately not Herman's body. So he remains at the bottom of the Zuiderzee. So that was a great connection to be able to talk to some descendants, and it makes all the difference. The third gentleman is Shiro Togo, who was with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. I picked his story. It's just one you can't overlook. There's the Lost Battalion, and every war has had a Lost Battalion, I think. But these men from the 141st Infantry were stranded in the mountains in northern France. And they had been cut off. They went up to the mountains to fight with supplies for one day, food for one day, ammunition for one day, anything they could carry for one day, and got cut off. And team after team from their other battalions with their group went in to try to rescue them and failed. A week later, they're still up there. They are existing on almost nothing. All of our attempts to drop in food failed as well. So the American Army called in the 442nd. The 442nd was a Japanese Nisei troop, all Japanese American citizens who had volunteered to fight, and they sent them in. Their motto was go for broke. They did not fail, whatever mission they took, and they went in and found the Lost Battalion and got them out at an enormous cost to their unit, and Shiro Togo was one of the ones who was killed on October 21st in rescuing these men. So again, a story that you just can't overlook. And then the next one is George McElroy. He had been in World War I, and he was with his Veterans Administration in Mason City, Iowa, and he had been with the American Legion. He was on their board or on a director, and he said when World War II came, he said, I've got to sign up again. He thought he was maybe too old, but they accepted him, and he was on a destroyer in the Pacific, and as you know, things change, and the Army is in charge, and you might think you have your position in the Army, and things change. Well, they decided when they got to Alaska, ADAC, that he, and I don't really know the reason, but they transferred him to shore. Now, I don't think it was anything he did wrong, but the records don't exist. He went to shore. Well, he was a newspaper man. He finds himself in Adak, Alaska. And who is in Adak, Alaska? Dashiell Hammett. He's writing a newspaper. He's head of the newspaper for the armed forces in Alaska. And here's George, and he's, I mean, he must have been beside himself to be able to work on the newspaper. His hometown newspaper put an article about their hero who was in Adak, and a couple weeks later, they put a second article. He died of a heart attack. And that to me also spoke to all the deaths that weren't necessarily people who were fighting. I mean, he had chosen to enlist, but that's not how he died. And then I'll say George W. Pittman. I can't look at that face and not say he's going to be in this book. He was a 7th grade educated black man from Scotland Neck, North Carolina. I live in North Carolina. I don't know where Scotland Neck is. It's a very small town. He came from a family of 6 children, joined the Navy, and raised through the ranks. His middle name was Washington, George Washington Pittman. Believe it or not, I encountered several George Washingtons, several John Pershings, Woodrow Wilsons, all who died on October 24th. But this George Pittman was very special to me. He died on the USS Shark, which we will come back and mention a little bit later. It's kind of a spoiler to the book, but we'll mention it anyway. And then the last one, I'm probably jumping the gun, we're going to talk about women. There were only 350,000 women who served out of 16 million men in the war. No, it wasn't that women didn't think about serving, but they were put into traditional roles, nurses and clerks. I could not find a single woman who died on October 24th, and I was distraught. And I know when I talked to the University of Missouri, they would really want to have a well-rounded book. We had all 24 chapters finished. The book was pretty well making its way down the road, and somehow Margaret Neubauer shows up on my computer, died on October 24th at 9:45 a.m. in the Proving Grounds in Virginia. She was a specialist, and I'll talk a little bit more about her when we talk about women later, but she was killed was hit by a truck on the Proving Grounds as she was returning to her barracks. So again, she had to make the book. So it's a little bit of everything, and I thought that was as it should be.
Well, I think what the book illustrates so well is the truism of history that everyone has a story,
Yes,
right? It's so easy
absolutely.
to reduce casualties and fatality lists to mere numbers, whereas you've done a fantastic job really giving personality really to the characters that you talk about, the real individuals obviously in the book. There are 2 really tragic stories that stuck out to me when I was reading the book, and they're both naval stories to some extent, but these are the 2 sort of highest casualty events that you talk about in the book. And the first one is an incident involving 2 ships, USS Birmingham and USS Princeton, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is raging on October 24th, 1944. This was a story that I was vaguely familiar with as someone who studies the war, but you really fleshed this story out in considerable depth, and I learned quite a bit from the book. So what is the story of the Princeton and the Birmingham, and why is this so tragic?
Yes, and there's a picture here. The Princeton is on the left, the carrier, and the cruiser Birmingham is on the right in their better days, I should say, earlier in the war. They had both been traveling throughout the Pacific, involved in many of the battles up until the time that we went back into the Philippines. For those who may not recall, the Battle of the Philippines, as you say, was going on. We landed back in the Philippines. General MacArthur made his famous "I have returned" speech on the 20th of October. So the war or the battles there had just started, but and the troops were moving inland, and there were many, many deaths as they tried to cross through the Philippines. But the ships were still out at sea, protecting our troops, or delivering more troops, delivering more supplies. And there was constant enemy activity around, and the Princeton was out at sea, just off of Leyte, where the landings had taken place. And there were some Japanese bombers, airplanes flying through and harassing the ships, bombing, making strafing runs on the shore, et cetera. And they called it a Judy bomber. Our men gave the Japanese bombers women's names. I still haven't figured out why. But, so a Judy bomber came over and dropped a bomb on the Princeton, and it hit the deck, went through one level of deck, down into the next level, down into the next level, and that's where it exploded. Captain Burewacker said he looked at the damage and said, I thought it was a small hole and it wouldn't do too much damage. Well, it didn't until it kept going through these levels of the decks until it exploded. And the picture on your left is the ship where a massive plume of smoke when it exploded went up. So the other ships in the area came to the Princeton's rescue. A couple of destroyers and cruisers came over there. They are designed to fight fires and had many crew members on them who were trained in firefighting. And the Captain Inglis of the Birmingham, ships were docking and actually tied up next to the Princeton while it was on fire. And the Birmingham said, I really have the capability. I have more hoses and more men who are trained in firefighting, so some of the ships pulled back. They tethered up to the Princeton, who was now dead in the water, and they had to keep moving their engines with the tides, and the current was pushing the Princeton one way and the Birmingham the other way, so they finally strung ties to keep the two together while they fought the fire. And they actually put out the initial fire over about a 5-hour period of fighting these fires. And the picture in the middle on the screen is the men on the Birmingham looking over at the Princeton. So you can see they're very, very close. The two ships are next to each other. And they were pretty well satisfied that it wasn't all over, but things looked pretty good. And so then there was some more enemy activity, and so they had to untie and move away. And once it turned out to be nothing, so the Birmingham moved back, they tied up again. And 5 hours after that initial explosion, the ammunition in the lower deck exploded. It caused untold havoc on deck. Many of the men on the Birmingham, because they had been tied up for hours and were successful in fighting this, had come on deck to watch the firefighting. These were men that didn't have anything else to do, so they all came up on the deck, and some of them, you can see, we were just watching, although many of them were helping fight the fires themselves, even though that might not be their training. So what happened is when the Princeton exploded, debris as small as pieces of shrapnel and as large as cars flew up into the sky and landed on the Birmingham mostly, and some on the Princeton, of course. It killed 300 men on the Birmingham and another 100 on the Princeton, if I have my numbers right. Horrific deaths. There was a chaplain and a medic who saw the men and were running to everyone's rescue. And they said this was one time when the blood ran like rivers on the deck. It was horrific, and men were terribly burned, many, many killed, obviously. And the captain, actually, John Hoskins on the Princeton, was hurt in the explosion. His foot was actually amputated or cut in half. And so actually a surgeon cut the other half of his foot off while he's on the deck. And the man retains his consciousness and is talking to people. And finally, when he gets ready and they bandage him up, he actually went to the captain and said, "Permission to leave this ship, sir." And this is going on in the middle of all this devastation. So it was a horrific accident, the second most, as you say, deadly of the day. And it really required, as I look back on the numbers, an event as big as this in order to get to that 2,600. There weren't 2,600 individual men who died around the war. You had to find incidents like this, and as tragic as they were. But the Birmingham survived. The picture on the right is the damage done to the Birmingham. You can see after they had put out the fires and had contained their ship and cleaned it up a bit and took it back for repairs. But the Princeton had to be sunk. And I tell the story, it was also a tragedy the way it had to be sunk. They gave a destroyer, the Reno, the orders to go ahead and sink the ship when they knew the Princeton couldn't be saved. It was so badly damaged. They fired, much like the Tang experience, if you haven't seen it here at the museum, they fired 5 torpedoes that all missed or hit a part of the ship that wouldn't take it down. And they finally discovered that battleship, a cruiser, had been tied up to the Princeton during the early parts of the day and they had been colliding back and forth, and they believed that damaged the torpedo capabilities or the functions. So they finally had to call the Irwin, in to actually sink the Princeton before, because they couldn't let it survive or be taken over by the Japanese. So that was one tragic event.
It's one of those scenes, it's almost impossible to fathom what that
Yes.
must have been like, and it really is disturbing in so many ways.
Yeah.
The other really disturbing story and tragic story that you highlight in the book, and you kind of weave it through narratively, no spoilers here, is the story of the Japanese ship Arisan Maru. The Arisan Maru represents the largest single loss of life that you talk about in the book, and in fact, unless I'm mistaken, it's the greatest maritime loss of life in American history.
It is.
This is a story that I was somewhat aware of as someone who studies this, but I think the vast majority of Americans are not familiar with the story of the Arisan Maru or the similar ships that were sailing at this point. So what is the story of the Arisan Maru, and why do you think that Americans aren't more familiar with this part of the history of the war in the Pacific?
Those are easy questions, because
No pressure.
they have great answers. I have a picture up there. On the top on the left is the Montevideo Maru. It was the first hell ship that was sunk by the American forces. The hell ships, and I had no idea what hell ships were, and I say in the book, many of the soldiers who were on the hell ships may not have known what a hell ship was before they got on, but when they heard the word, they knew what a hell ship was. Again, this is October 24th. The Japanese had known that the Americans were coming back. They had enough intelligence out there that they knew our ships were coming, and they knew that we wanted to take back the Philippines. And so it wasn't unexpected. And by this time, they had, you've heard of the Bataan Death March and all of the troops that surrendered after we lost the Philippines were in the prisoner of war camps. And Japan was going through a difficult time in their own economic situation back in their homelands, and they needed labor. They needed labor for their mines, manufacturing to help keep their ships going. So they decided, what better way to fill our labor needs than to get the prisoners that we're holding in the Philippines and elsewhere around the South Pacific and bring them back to Japan and let them labor there. So they began emptying the prisoner of war camps. At the Montevideo, I've forgotten exactly how many, I think there were 1,200, but these were mostly Australian prisoners on board when they were sunk, because what they put them on these freighters. They were cargo ships, or in some cases liners, that they had refitted to carry prisoners in their holds, not in cabins or anything quite so decent as that, but in the cargo holds. They were unmarked because they were taking sometimes supplies, sometimes passengers, and oftentimes the prisoners. This started, Montevideo was the first one that started earlier in 44, before we returned, but it continued at a greater height. No one knows exactly how many of these ships were transported or how many prisoners they transported or how many died exactly. But the next one was the Orinoco Maru that traversed in December 44. It too was sunk by an American submarine, again unmarked, and transporting prisoners back to Japan. In the Orinoco Maru's case, while there were almost as many POWs on board as the Arisan Maru, they actually survived. They were close to land, and the prisoners were in the water after the ship was broken apart, and they swam to shore, only, of course, to be picked up by the Japanese and then herded together and put on the Rona Maru, which is the bottom ship. No prize for surviving. They were then put on the next ship. The conditions on those ships were horrific. At the top left, top right, there is an artist's drawing because there were no cameras, as you can expect, on these ships. So there were prisoners who did survive some of the ships, who drew likenesses of what occurred. These men, as you need to understand, came out of the prisoner of war camps. They were already emaciated. They were already, many of them, malnutrition, beriberi, practically near death. They had been beaten and many other atrocities. And they were then put on these hell ships in the cargo holds. They were given 1 cup of water, 1 cup of rice a day. They were put in holds that would carry maybe 200 or 300 people, 1,000, 1,500. Nowhere to sit, nowhere to lay down. They were stuffed body to body. The latrine facilities were 5 5-gallon cans at the front of the cargo hold. If you were at the back or anywhere past the second row, you are not going to take your available use of the latrines. They were on these ships for a week. The temperatures in the hold went way over 100 degrees. And some men said the sides of the ship were so hot, and the men were pressed against them, that it would burn your skin to stand against them. People went mad. Some killed others to survive, and some luckily survived. Now the Arisan Maru, while there is a nicer picture of the Arisan Maru that exists, I chose this one because it looks like a hell ship, and it was. There were 1,800 American prisoners out of Camp Cabanatuan, the people who survived the Bataan Death March, who were on this ship in this condition. They actually, when they were stuffed into one of the holds halfway through the trip, and they were on this ship for 12 days. Halfway through the ship, there were so many people dying. And of course they left the bodies, such as they could, with the men who were in the hold. And they finally realized they needed to stop the dying, because what the Japanese ship captains knew were their orders were that they had to bring these men in ready working condition to the Japanese homelands. Well, this was not going to happen. So they transferred 600 of the men out of the 1,800 into a second hold. That hold was 1/3 filled with coal. So these men now stood on shards of coal for the other 6-7 days of their trip. So miraculously, most of them were still alive on the 24th when it was torpedoed and went down. It sank in 2 hours. And I have one more slide about the Arisan Maru. If you can't imagine, and I can't, 1,800 men, I put this graphic of each of those icons is 10 men. There are 180 icons up there, so that's 1,800 men were crammed into these holds. They all went into the water, and all but 9, the last little icon, died on October 24th. And it is a tragedy. You ask, well, why don't people know this? Well, in fact, we can talk a little bit about the 9 survivors, 5 of whom are pictured here. There, of course, were no Allied witnesses to this, so there was not going to be any newspaper report. So you can look October 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th. You will not find a headline about the Arisan Maru. We did not know about it until these gentlemen came home who survived. And they didn't make it back to the United States until December 5th, I believe it was. And they were then brought to the White House, given medals, and told not to speak about the incident. At that time, we didn't really know. I mean, these 5 men show up and talk about this horror that, of course, Americans didn't really want to be released if they didn't have to or until they knew more about what exactly happened. And we really didn't know who sank the Arisan Maru at the time. And it was one of our submarines. So,
And so that represents the largest loss of life that you talk about,
Yes.
in the book. One more question before I want to open up to the audience. I'm sure there's a ton of great questions out there, but maybe one brief question here. We often forget that general conditions were hazardous in World War II, even if you weren't in combat. And when we think about the war, we often think about people who lose their lives in combat, but you actually talk about individuals, both men and women, who lose their lives in non-combat situations. Can you tell us about some of those stories that really fascinating stories in a lot of ways, tragic stories that you talk about in the book?
right. I also, as you say, I'm very partial to not overlooking people who signed up for the war. I mean, to me, if you volunteered, you went down, you enlisted, you went through boot camp, you're with your unit, you're in the Army now, as they say. And these people deserve as much recognition, even if they never made it to the theater. So I always look at what they call the zone of the interior of the United States. And on October 24th, there was a crew flying on their last training mission. They left Nebraska. Their route was to come to Baton Rouge and then refuel and go back. And within a week, they were supposed to go to the Pacific. So they took off at 3 a.m. from Nebraska, 4 a.m. from Nebraska, got in here to Baton Rouge, refueled, 10 men on the plane, a very experienced pilot, refueled, went to the end of the runway, took off, and crashed immediately at the end of the runway. It's in a Barksdale field. At the end, they set fire to the woods. At the end, everyone perished. And I'd like to, these men, as I say, bet for a week would have been in the Pacific somewhere and maybe had died. And I think they deserve as much recognition as all of the rest. The fascinating thing to me, when I saw that, I said, how do you top that? Well, there were 2 other plane crashes on that day in the United States where 10 or 11 men were killed because their plane crashed. And you can imagine the headlines. The Baton Rouge, the Barksdale Field accident hadn't happened before the news came out that another one had crashed, one in Kansas and one in California. And this was going on, and you think, well, how did these young men fly these planes? Again, we have a hard time understanding this. It was the infancy of flight. And the B-29 had particular problems. And one of the planes that crashed was a B-29. That pilot got in that plane, and in the days before, there had been 3 B-29s that went down in China. And yet he gets on his plane, takes off, and it's an 18 or a 20 or a 22-year-old who has to say, it can't happen to me. I'm better than that. I'm a good pilot. It won't happen. Well, it did. So there were accidents like that in plane crashes. We talked about Margaret Neubauer being hit by a truck. There was a gentleman who had visited the Pope. He was a Catholic, and he was moving in transit from with his group from one place to another, and they'd gone through Rome, and there was a chance to see the Pope, and he got his rosary blessed by the Pope. He was in the truck, and it veered off the road, crashed, and he was killed. But his rosary made it back to his family, and it's just, again, stories like that touch my heart, and I hope you will find them too, that they touch your heart if you read the book.
Absolutely fascinating. I think we should open it up to questions from the audience. I'm sure there's a ton. We have a microphone in the back. One of my colleagues will bring by. Who has some questions for Rona Simmons? Ma'am.
First question will be to your right. Help me to understand why the survivors were told not to talk about the Arian Maru. Was it because it could have been bombed by the Americans and they didn't want that to come out?
Well, it was a number of factors. Of course, the tide of the war had turned, and the American military, or government, Washington, D.C., it wasn't that they didn't want that to get out. It was because it was the largest. 1,800 men. Most of the reporting is, a unit got trapped, 10 men died, 20 men died, 100 men died. but 1800 would have been devastating to the morale of the country. And they were having to fight that battle as well on the home front, is to keep the morale of people up. So these men came home in December and had this probably what was considered a wild story because they didn't know this was going on. These ships were sinking with Australians and other nationalities. It had not happened to Americans to their knowledge. So they had to verify it as best they could. Well, that was going to be difficult because these are the only 5 men who know about this. Shall we give the spoiler up?
No, don't
No,
spoilers.
don't
But I have a
You'll
follow-up
have to
question.
read the book.
It's a great question, but when did the families of those 1,800 men get closure on what had happened to them?
So they made it home thanks to the Chinese who helped get them back to the U.S. And they had arrived in Washington, were debriefed, as we do, and where their story was told. And then they went back to their families. By that time, these 5 men's families knew, but because the larger population didn't know, it was not actually in the papers until June or July 1945, 6 months before the rest of the people, the other roughly 1,800 families found out the date and how their sons died. And again, it's such a different world back then. We think, well, look at a war today. I mean, the family knows within 24 hours. People didn't get correspondence. They didn't even know that their child had been in prison or where their prison was or whether they were on this ship or anywhere else. So it took such a long time to verify the list of prisoners who was on the ship. I mean, these 5 men knew 20 men, 100 men. No one knew all 1,800. There was no passenger list. And so it took years until the Japanese actually shared the documentation with us to find out who actually was on the ship.
And you can imagine the emotional roller coaster for those families of not knowing what was going on with their loved one. As the war is ending in Europe, you have VE Day and then victory in the Pacific as well, and there's still really no clarity. Other questions?
We have one up
over
in
here.
the front.
Well, for our live stream, folks, please use the mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rona, just remind us, how many people died in D-Day?
Good question. There were 2,615 men, by my count, on October 24th. There are 2,353 who died, official count, on D-Day on the one day. What I was doing, because people will say, well, the Battle of the Bulge, 19,000 men died during the Battle of the Bulge, but not that many. It was spread out over 6-7 weeks. So finding the actual date of death, so on D-Day, and luckily D-Day we know so much about, there was a scholar who did actually go through the archives and find the actual date and how many died on the 6th. And that was 2,353. My numbers are actually a little greater than that because I was counting not just the men on the beaches, but somebody who might have been in the Pacific or somewhere else or in the United States on that day. I mixed that. That's the number for Pearl Harbor. D-Day was, I think, total on that day was 2,600. So it's by a nose, but it's 2,615. I always say, because the records are so muddied, with the fire in St. Louis, of course, it destroyed a lot of the records. It's not just looking up the American Battle Monuments Commission, who has all the records of people who were buried in the cemeteries. There are tombstones that are incorrect. I don't care what the date might say, so you can't just say, oh, well, I found the tombstone. Until I found 2 or 3 sources, I didn't count someone as having died on that day. Most often, a lot of times in the Air Force, when you had a missing air crew, if they were killed on July 1st, 1944, they were declared dead on July 2nd, 1945, a year from the date they died. That's their official death date. Because they thought, well, we don't want to declare someone dead and tell their family and then lo and behold, they find they survived. So they were allowed to give a year before officially, unless they found facts afterwards. So it's a very, very difficult process, and I'm quite sure I'll be proved wrong one day, but there were still 2,615, I can vouch for that on 24th.
And what's interesting is, had the Arisan Maru and the Birmingham incidents not happened the same day, D-Day would have been the deadliest day. for
Yes,
Americans.
yeah. It really, that's why I say it really took because the numbers, even though the average throughout the war was 300 men a day, and even that, I say, it became normal to lose 300 men a day. So 800, 900 would often happen in these major battles. 1,000 men might pass. But to get into the numbers like 2,600, you have to have a D-Day or Pearl Harbor or an Arisan Maru in the Princeton.
There's another question, I think, over here.
Yeah, we'll stay over on this side.
Hi, so you said there were 9 survivors. What happened to the other 4?
Well, I should say you need to read the book, but actually 5 men survived. They all found floated, what do they call it, flotsam and jetsam, or these 5 found a life raft, but others found things to hang on to. They were actually, the other 4 were actually recaptured by the Japanese and sent back to prison camps. And so they came back to the U.S. At different dates.
Other questions?
I think there's another one over here.
Question over here.
I'm curious. I heard at one time that reparations were sought from the Japanese government because of the forced labor that they were made to perform. Do you know if any of that ever happened, if reparations were made?
Well, I can speak about the prisoners of war in particular. There was a ceremony, and I'm going to forget the date now, many decades after the war, because apologies were asked of the Japanese once things had moved on from the war. We wanted an apology, and for years and years, the prisoners of war, who were all terribly mistreated, were looking for Japan to apologize. They made mumblings about how difficult the times had been, and everything came up very short of an apology even. We're not talking reparations, just apologizing. And there was one of the last survivors of the prisoner of war camps attended the ceremony when Mitsubishi Mining Company, which was one of the owners of the mines where they worked, came out with a formal statement that recognized their mistreatment of the prisoners. And they still said, well, it came kind of short of an apology, but he said, I think that's all we're going to get, and I will live with that. And they have erected a placard at the head of the mine that talks about the very horrific conditions. But as far as I know, no reparations.
We have a question here in the back.
Hello, Rona. Thanks very much for your insights. I'm curious if your research yielded any kind of sort of data or demographic insights about where these men came from, what states they're born, if they're from cities or from rural areas, different class backgrounds, different racial backgrounds. I love the idea of this book just as a sort of snapshot of the war and of the sort of the casualties here as a sort of a slice of American life. So I'm just curious if you found any, if there are large numbers of soldiers from a specific state or a specific region or a specific area. I'm wondering if you just have any demographics on these men and women.
Well, it pretty much mirrors the war in the sense that largely these were white men or some Hispanics, but that was a minority of the population. I mean, it mirrored the population of the America back in 1940s, which was largely white. There were a number of black men who weren't allowed to serve until later in the war in only very certain positions, so you can imagine the blacks were of a minority. The Japanese Americans who were interned in camps when the war started for fears, they volunteered in great numbers. They did not want to sit and not serve their country, and so they joined up. But again, that's a very, very small percentage of the population back in that time as well. Native Americans. I've read that 99% of the eligible men in Native American tribes volunteered and enlisted. They weren't drafted, they enlisted. And so that's a large percentage of that demographic, but again, a very small portion of the population. So it really was mixed in terms of demographics. In terms of states, the deaths are, again, distributed pretty much population. California is a big one. New Mexico, Arizona, a lot in the Philippines. A lot of those men were in the artillery and were sent to the Philippines. So I didn't add it up that way, but I think they probably have a disproportionate share in those two. But beyond that, it was, for the most part, where the population was. Good question, thank you.
Any other questions? If not, can we have a round of applause for Rona and
Thank you.
Bradley?
Well, thank you, Rona, and thank you, Bradley. This is a wonderful, as Sean said, a wonderful snapshot of this one day. Really, in all my years doing this, a very unique way of looking at World War II. Why do we need another World War II book out there? This is a prime example. So thank you very much for sharing this broad story, but these individual stories as well. As I mentioned earlier, we have copies of her book out there that you and only you get to grab for the next, is it 8 days, I guess? Yeah. 8 days, and she'll be signing them over in front of the LCVP, the Higgins boat. So make sure you get a copy or two, and then you get to see the rest of the story and some of those questions that weren't fully answered. You'll find the answer yourself. Again, I'd like to invite those of you to come over to the extended happy hour at Kilroy's in the Higgins Hotel. Bradley and I'll run off the stage and get over there to beat you in line at the bar. But that'll be going on until 9 o'clock tonight. Next month, please raise your hand if you've bought a ticket for the International Conference on World War II. Well, too bad for all of you because we are sold out. But the good news is, for those of you here and those of you watching at home, we will be live streaming all 3 days of the conference. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, November 21, 22, 23. This is no disrespect to tonight or any of the other author events we have. This is our marquee event of the year where we bring 30-plus speakers from around the world. 350 people will be in the ballroom. So maybe you don't want to be in the ballroom with 349 other people. But we'll have 3 really intensive days of lively and informative discussion. So please tune in to that. It'll be on our webpage, it'll be on our YouTube page, and our Vimeo. You all know you'll certainly get emails about it. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you to Bradley for running a wonderful conversation, and most importantly, thank you to Rona Simmons.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. That was great.
Thank you.
That was great.